Hey guys, Justin Boyer here with The Heart Cut. And on this episode, we're going to talk about the Shin 10-year-old Japanese whiskey. I'm going to give you my review of it, but when I was drinking it, it brought up some ideas about Japanese whiskey, some issues with the Japanese whiskey industry. So we're going to talk about Japanese whiskey and transparency. Let's get started. So in today's episode, we're talking about, right here, the Shin Malt Whisky 10-year-old, finished in Mizunara oak, which is the Japanese oak. Here's the box that you may find this in. But before I get into the flavor of the whiskey itself, there's something I want to discuss. You may or may not be aware that sometimes Japanese whiskeys are a little shady with where they get their stuff. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, there's two reasons why sometimes you don't know where Japanese whiskey is really coming from. The first reason is that the Japanese government has not created hardcore regulations for Japanese whiskey just yet. They're working on it, but it's still kind of a free-for-all. For instance, there's no age limit for Japanese whiskey. Therefore, somebody could just make whiskey, bottle it straight off the still, and call it whiskey, even though it's not aged. However, that doesn't mean that all Japanese whiskey is bad, and we'll talk about that in a second. The second reason is that traditionally, Japanese distillers have not exchanged whiskeys with each other. Why is that important? Well, a lot of Japanese whiskey is referred to as blended whiskey, and that's because what a lot of distilleries do is they'll create several different types of whiskey. They'll make a peated one, they'll make one in a pot still, one in a column still, a lighter, a heavier. They'll make all those different kinds in-house, age them all separately, and then blend them, bottle them, and send them out. Again, because they don't share whiskeys with each other. How is that different from Scotch? Well, if you've seen Dewar's or Johnny Walker or Compass Box or Monkey Shoulder or any of those types of blends, in Scotland, they're actually going to different single malt distilleries, pooling their single malt and blending them together and putting them into a bottle. Some Johnny Walkers have up to 30 or 40, even more whiskeys in a single bottle, single malts, and grain whiskeys as well. But all those different distilleries are like, yeah, sure, here, take our stock, take some of our casks, and go make your blends. In Japan, they don't do that. So you have to make everything in-house. Think about it this way. You're a brand new distillery just launching up. In the United States, a lot of new distilleries will actually source from other distilleries that are already making whiskey, and they may age it differently, they may bottle it, blend it, whatever. That's pretty common. Otherwise, the only option is to make gin or vodka. Why? Because distilleries take a lot of money and you need cash flow, and because of the aging requirements of different whiskeys, when you make a whiskey, you know that you're not going to bottle it for a long time. So a lot of times it's easier at first, even if you're making whiskey, is you put your whiskey in the cask, you let it age, and while that's happening, you source the whiskey from someone else, and then bottle it to make some cash. Think of the whiskeys like High West, Rendezvous Rye, or Whistle Pig. Those are actually sourced from other places. That's not their own whiskey. Why does that matter when we're talking here about the Shin? I'm going to give you one more look at the bottle. But on the back, it says Shinobu Distillery. I don't know if you can read that or not. But the distillery name is Shinobu Distillery. So when I looked this up, it's a distillery that in 2017, they got their license to distill. It was actually a brewery before that. The man who created this is named Ken Usami. And he wanted to create whiskeys, so he got his whiskey license. However, the website itself says that the distillery is still under construction. And that's today, I just looked at it. So they got their license in 2017. They're still trying to get their own whiskey out. So obviously this whiskey is not made by them. It's brought in from somewhere else. Now, what is the problem with transparency? Well, it's because a lot of Japanese whiskeys will actually import Scotch and put it into their whiskeys and put it out as their blend. Now, obviously, if they're transparent about it and tell you, that's not really as much of a problem. For example, one of my favorite distilleries is Crowded Barrel Whiskey Company down in Texas. Now, they do make some of their own whiskey. For example, this is the single malt of Magnificence. This actually won Best Texas Single Malt at a recent whiskey festival in Texas. But one thing I do like about Crowded Barrel is their transparency. Even on the back of the label, it tells you exactly what's in it. 50% Maris Otter, which is the barley. 50% Irish peated Maris Otter, aged in used oak for 3 years. But this is something that they made. This is an example of a blend. This is still Crowded Barrel, but they created Magnificent Beast, and they did this by blending sourced whiskeys from other distilleries. What's the difference? The difference is, right on the label, they tell you exactly where it came from. It says it's a blend of 75% malt whiskey that's at least 3 years old from Balcones. 22.2% 15-year-old MGP light whiskey, which is whiskey made in a column still. And then 2.8% 2-year-old whiskey distilled at real spirits. So this is full transparency. You know exactly what's in this. This is Balcones, real spirits, MGP, all mixed together. It's a delicious whiskey. It's absolutely fantastic. What is the issue with Japanese whiskey? Well, Japanese distilleries and bottlers, if they're importing Scotch, don't always tell you that that's what they're doing. According to Shinobu's website, all it says is that Mr. Usami, the master blender, selected the finest malt whiskeys and finished them in casks made of Japanese oak. I don't know what malt whiskeys he's talking about. This could be Scotch, this could be Japanese, this could be anywhere. It just says he's found malt whiskeys and aged them in Mizunara oak. I just wish there's a little bit more transparency here. Exactly where did this come from? And here's the reason why. When I smell this whiskey, and I'll get to the review, this smells like a Scotch to me. It's much heavier than what you might typically find in a Japanese whiskey. Now, it's not to say Japanese whiskeys are not flavorful, but the way that they present their flavors is much more orderly, layered. Now, I'm getting a lot of dark fruits, wood spices. This is almost striking me actually as a sherried whiskey. Now again, these are finished in the oak casks. I don't know how long, but it's finished in the oak casks. I mean, it was somewhere else. If I'm smelling this kind of profile, it strikes me as very Scotch-like. But in terms of what I'm smelling, lots of dark fruits. There's a touch of vanilla. There's some wood spices in there. There's also a little bit of the slightest touch of some sweetness, right? Some oaky sweetness. But it's very forward with dark fruits, raisins, figs, dates. On the deeper inhale, even a sharper inhale, I'm starting to pick up that Mizunara oak and starting to pick up on those sandalwood incense, which is actually called aloes wood, I just found out, but what Japanese use in incense. Now in terms of flavor, the dark fruits come forward, but on the finish, that's where the Mizunara really shines. The dark fruits are still there, but I think on the palate, more of that sandalwood, that Mizunara finish comes forward. Still that sweetness in the back. So a little bit of that kind of vanilla sweetness. But it actually is a fantastic whiskey. Now, this whiskey actually won double gold at the San Francisco World Spirits Competition. In the Asia International Spirits Competition, it got a score of 95, won a gold there too. So, is this a bad whiskey? No, it's not a bad whiskey at all. In fact, I would suggest that you buy a bottle. I would say the reason why you want to buy this, and whether it's Scotch or not, I really don't know. I don't know where any of this came from. It's not all Japanese whiskey. I'm almost sure of that. However, I'm not trying to badmouth Mr. Usami. I'm not trying to badmouth the Shinobu distillery at all. I just wish they would tell you a little bit more about where it came from. He got it from Scotland, imported it, put it into a bottle, slapped a sticker on it, and called it Japanese whiskey. There's some ethical issues with that, I'm not going to lie. Especially if you don't tell anybody. But at the same time, a good whiskey is a good whiskey. And honestly, this is a really good whiskey. So it's hard to sit here and say don't buy it. Absolutely buy this. but understand that you might not be getting the pure Japanese whiskey that you're looking for. However, because of the market and the condition it's in right now, pure Japanese whiskeys, right, like the really good ones, like Yamazaki, Kurosawa, all those are insanely expensive, right? Even a 12-year-old Yamazaki is like $150 a bottle. And for some people, that's probably a bit too much, unless you're used to buying Macallan. So, there are some that are more affordable. Suntory Toki comes to mind. That's actually a really solid blend for about $30. There's a couple other options. The Nikas, Suntories, those are real deal distilleries that are making their own stuff. They have been for 100 years now. So you don't have to worry about those. But I'm seeing a lot more of these Japanese whiskeys popping up where you're just not quite sure where they're from. You don't know what they're doing, or is this a new distillery, an old distillery? Is this just somebody bottling whiskey from somewhere? They have all these nice names and stuff on the labels, but you really have no idea exactly where they're from. So, what's the bottom line? I believe that distilleries need to be transparent. Blenders also need to be transparent. However, the magic that they're doing is the blending piece. Blending everything together, making a beautiful whiskey. And there's nothing wrong with that. I personally have actually begun blending. I have some bottles right here. And I'll be releasing to my subscribers, my paid subscribers, my recipes for these. So you can actually make them at home. But there'll be another video on that coming up shortly. But the bottom line is, a good whiskey is a good whiskey, and I'm not going to tell anybody not to buy a whiskey that's this delicious. The Shin 10-year-old from Shinobu Distillery is actually a fantastic whiskey. I got it for $90. I think it's well worth that price. I probably wouldn't go over 100. If you can find it for 70 or 80, that's a steal. It's actually a really delicious whiskey. I just wish I knew a little bit more about where it came from, because a lot of people are going to look at it and say Japanese whiskey and assume that 100% of it came from Japan, when in reality, based on its flavor profile, I honestly don't believe that. I believe it was Scotch first. Then the Scotch was imported, aged in Mizunara oak for a little bit, and then released as Japanese whiskey. Unfortunately, this is a bit of a gray area. There's no black and white, and until whiskey regulations in Japan catch up, it's going to be hard, to decide what's what. Because on the one hand, this whiskey is one of the best representations I've seen of what Mizunara oak can really do for a whiskey. That little added touch of sandalwood and incense and those Mizunara flavors are just absolutely perfect with what I feel is a sherried base. But the question remains, if the regulations change in Japan, will these kind of whiskeys even be allowed anymore? It's a tough question to answer. But regardless of what happens, if you see this bottle, I suggest you pick it up. I think it's actually a really good buy. But just understand when you're buying it that it may not all come from Japan. That's it for me today. Please like and subscribe if you want more content like this. And also, down in my description below is the link to my Heart Cut newsletter. Again, like I said, I'm making my own blends. I'm going to release tasting notes on these blends soon. And when I do that, I'm going to release the recipes for them only to my paid subscribers. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.